In this lesson, we're going to be preparing our Illustrator assets for import to After Effects. Okay, so I'm just starting out here in the Illustrator file 02_begin. And if you are creating an infographic or designing an infographic in Illustrator course, you probably recognize this image. But I've changed just a few things. So I've gone in and taken out the parts that we're not going to be needing for our animation, and I've added a few new things as well. So I want to talk to you about what we need to do to this file to get it ready for After Effects. So as it sits right now, I've got my layers panel open, and you can see that there are only 6 layers here. Now it's going to be really easy to just import this whole thing into After Effects, and if you do it as a composition, we would have access to these 6 layers, and that is a great way to work. But I want to have individual access to all of these pieces. So you can see these corals, I can click them individually, but you can see that as I'm clicking through all of these, it's still only selecting layer 16 because all of these are considered groups or paths within that layer. So right now these are all groups because there's multiple paths making up those groups. So what we need to do if we want to have individual access to all of these is put them on their own layers. Now that takes a lot of time. You have to come down here, create a new layer, grab whichever one you want, and then drag it up to that layer, and then After Effects will be able to recognize that as its own layer once the project is imported. But doing that by hand is very tedious. So I have a script that we can use that is going to automatically take anything that is a path inside of any of these layers and put it into its own layer here on the outside. So you would have, hundreds of layers out here. And that's what After Effects is going to look at. So anything we want individual animation access to, we need to have on its own layer. So that being said, you need to do a little bit of preliminary work even before that to make sure that nothing has been grouped together that you want to have individual access to. So it's going to look at all of those groups that we were just looking at and put those on its own layer. But what if, for instance, down here in this lower corner, I'm just going to hold Alt to zoom in on that. What if I have things grouped that I don't want to be grouped? So you can see these right here. I have individual access to those just because I'm able to click and only see one at a time. But if I click the blue, you can see those have all been grouped together. So we need to ungroup those so that we have individual access to all of those columns. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. We'll hit Control-Shift-G to ungroup those. And now you can see I have individual access to each of those blue columns. Another thing that I want to have individual access over is just the ability to move these words. So I'm going to ungroup them. So select it, hit Control-Shift-G, and then let's go ahead and move these over just so they fit in the columns a little bit better. Sometimes whenever you're creating a graph, the words don't line up just exactly as you may want them to. So ungrouping is one way of fixing that whenever you're working in Illustrator. So I'm just going to scoot those over just to kind of make that fit a little bit better. And now if you wanted to have individual access to these words once you were inside of After Effects, you could leave them just as their own paths, or we could group them back together if we want them to all be one piece. It's better to have more flexibility than less. So if you're not sure how you want to animate it, I would go ahead and just leave them as their own paths. But I know that these, I want to be able to just have all as one layer because it's a little more manageable just for the way that I'm going to animate it. You can see that this is all on one layer or all on one path. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We'll group those together, hit Control-G to group back. Okay, now let's zoom out a little bit and start to kind of move over here. And I'm just going to go through and kind of click and select just to see if things have been grouped that I want individual access to. And it's easy to see what you have individual access to just by clicking around here. So you can see that all of these things are on their own paths or groups just because of the way they're being selected. Now I want to have individual access to all of these little dots here on the graph, so I'm going to ungroup those. We'll hit Control-Shift-G, And let's make sure that that path, that line is all one piece. That looks like that is, so that's perfect. Those are all on their own paths. These are all on their own paths. I'm going to go ahead and group those together, just those dates. So we'll hit Control G to group that. Okay, so it looks like we have quite a few things that we've fixed here. Everything looks like it's pretty much the way that needs to be grouped for being imported to After Effects. Just kind of come up here, we'll check on those words. We've got that path by itself, so we'll be able to animate that all on its own. Now, one of the things I want to watch out for is if we just imported this huge artboard to After Effects, it would take a really long time to be able to see. So I want to make this a little bit more manageable artboard and then kind of just rearrange everything on it. So we're going to be working at 1280 by 720 in After Effects. So I could just make the artboard that size, but I'm going to go ahead and put it at 1280 by 1280 because that's going to be just a little bit easier to work with. So we'll come over here, click this artboard button, and we're going to want to be working in pixels. So right now that's set up to work in inches. If you want to, you can go to your document setup instead of just clicking the artboard button, and then you can change those units. So instead of having those at inches, let's change those to pixels. Go ahead and say OK. And now if we click that artboard button, we've got pixels up here. So let's go ahead and change that to 1280 by 1280. Okay, so a little bit more manageable this way. I'm going to zoom in, just holding Alt and using my mouse wheel. And let's just reorganize this a little bit better. Now I'm going to be treating these circles just a little bit differently. So I'm going to go ahead and select those, and we'll just put those outside of the artboard for a moment, and we'll come back to those in just a second. And I just want to make sure that nothing is overlapping too much that is going to cause any kind of confusion. So just being kind of mindful of that and moving these things around. Just scooting that over a bit. Move this up here and put this a little bit higher. And then all these we can just drag up there. Okay, so now all of those have been placed the way they need to be placed, but these we need to treat a little bit differently because I want them to be able to rotate directly from their centers. And so an easy way to make that happen is by putting those on their own artboards. Now, if I do it in this project, it's going to be a little bit more tricky. So what I'm going to do is we'll just come up here to File, New, and we'll just go ahead and stick with that default size. Just go ahead and say OK to that. And then let's go back over to our 02 Begin and select those pieces. Then we'll just drag them to the untitled one. Now what I want to do is give them each their own artboard. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of pull those apart just like this. Kind of put them in a row just to make it a little bit easier to deal with. And then we're going to put each of those on their own artboard. So a great and really easy way to do that is to come over here, grab your artboard tool, and just click on them, any group like that, and it's going to give you that artboard. Now, you have to have at least one artboard at a time. So I made that one first, then I'll go ahead and delete this big one. Then I can just come back down through here and create those other artboards I need. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 artboards, and those are going to be really easy to work with. So I want to show you how to save this so that we can import it in a really easy way. So let's come up here to File, and we'll go to Save As, and let's just go up one here, and we're going to go in our reference file. So double click that, and we'll just call this Legend, because this is the legend for the pie graph. Then we'll just go ahead and say Save. And then when we get to this dialog box, you want to come down here and check the option that says Save each artboard to a separate file. And you can click Range, and that'll give you the number. We want all of those, so all or range would work in this case. Then you just go ahead and say OK. And what it'll do is just start saving those out to different Illustrator files. So we'll be able to import each of those as a different Illustrator file once we get back into those project files. Okay, so we've taken care of those. So I can actually just come back over here and we can delete these if we need to, because we don't need them in this project anymore. Then I'm going to come down through here and we'll run that script that's going to put all of these on their own layers. So you want to make sure that nothing is locked that you want to be on its own layer. Go ahead and we'll select everything. And to run that script, you'll just come up here to File and go to Scripts and choose Other Script. And I'm just going to pull this over here for you. So we're in our project files folder. Go into your reference files and you have a script in here. So go ahead and click that script, the Illustrator Convert Paths to Individual Layers. Go ahead and open that up and you can see, bam, instantly all of those were put onto their own layers, and you can see that now we literally have hundreds of layers that we're going to be working with in After Effects. So now one of the next steps that you have to do is to go through and name these, just because it's a little bit easier to name when it's in Illustrator than renaming it in After Effects. That way if you need to make any changes here, it's easier to find what file you're trying to change or exactly which piece you're trying to change from this file if it's been named correctly in the first place. So instead of making you watch me go through here and rename all of these, I'm going to do it in between lessons, but it's really easy. All you have to do is just double click and you can type in what you want that layer to be called. So that's the waves layer. That's what's on this one right here. One last thing that I want to change really quickly is the color space of this document. When this was originally designed, it was in CMYK. We need to change it to RGB because we're going to be using all of these graphics to create videos or one single video. So let's come up here to File, and you'll see Document Color Mode, and just switch that over to RGB. And you see just a very slight change happened, not huge. So now that we have all of those steps done, I'm going to go through here, rename all of these, and we'll come back in our next lesson and be ready to import to After Effects. I also want to save this 0 to begin. I'll save this just as all of the layers split up, and that'll be in your reference files. I'll also save this as 0.3 end, or excuse me, 0.2 end, so that you'll have access to it after all of these steps that we've run through. So we'll come back in our next lesson and get started with putting our After Effects document together.